Robert Legvold is standing by. He's a professor of political science, specializes in Russia and Ukraine at Columbia University. Let's talk, Robert, if we can, about what Vladimir Putin can do. What is the off-ramp, so to speak, here for him that can both keep him popular domestically and also make sure that Russia does not become a pariah state?
Well, in the short run, he can do what he is already doing, which is behaving constructively in terms of facilitating a proper investigation of the crash. But that's only temporary, and it's not going to avoid the pressures that he will feel over the larger issue of the aid that he is providing, the cover that he's providing for the armed militants within eastern Ukraine. And he can no longer hide behind the ambiguity of his position. On the one hand, arguing that he's in favor of a ceasefire and a negotiated settlement, but at the same time assisting militant rebels that are unwilling to negotiate. That's now exposed, and he's going to have to take some key decisions.
Critics have said that it was in his strategy, in his interest, to sort of keep this part of Ukraine destabilized for as long as possible, if not indefinitely, to make sure Ukraine doesn't move towards Europe. Has he overplayed his hand now as this investigation continues? And again, the prime suspect is this SA-11 mobile missile defense system, Russian-made, possibly Russian-supplied.
Well, on the facts themselves, almost certainly the extent to which you can get close to conclusive evidence, it is going to show that the airplane was shot down by this Vuk missile, this SA-11, in the hands of separatists. There'll be a question of whether they had captured it from Ukrainian sources or whether the Russians had supplied it, but I don't think there's going to be much question that it came from the separatists. In that context, and the larger issue of keeping the pot boiling or not, Putin for some time has had to walk something of a tightrope because he learned some time ago that the violence could in fact escalate to civil war, which would destroy a strategy on his part of keeping Kiev off balance and begin drawing Russia into something enormously serious. At this point, the problem is somewhat different, and that is that if he is in fact abetting the military struggle on the part of the pro-Russian separatists in Eastern Europe and Eastern Ukraine in order to try to influence the larger political outcome in Ukraine. That is, what kind of a political orientation Ukraine settles on, in particular with what kind of a relationship to the West. He no longer can simply look as though he's a neutral figure in this struggle. The outside world, beginning with not just the United States, but increasingly the West Europeans and Canadians, are going to demand that he take active steps, demonstrable steps, to end the fighting in eastern Ukraine.
And just before we go, Robert, I want you to tell me how this is playing out domestically for him, because there's always this idea that he can say, I'm standing up to the world, standing up for Russia, defending our interests. But what about in his own country, his image?
It has basically worked for him. It is a more complicated issue than we often assume. He is popular. He's popular because particularly of the Crimean decision. And in Ukraine, people are sympathetic with him. A majority of Russians believe that he's being unfairly damned by the West, blamed for what's happened in this case. And they are willing to buy into some of the conspiracy theories that Russian media specialists and military offer. But at the same time, the assumption that he's cornered by nationalists who would see him betraying Eastern Europe if he began to put distance between himself and the militants and began to actually work toward a political settlement. That too is probably exaggerated, because I think the average Russian at this point, while they identify with Putin, do not identify with those hooded, armed separatists in eastern Ukraine. And in fact, I think a number of Russians, probably a majority, are fearful that what's happening in eastern Ukraine could drag Russia into a mess that they don't want to be dragged into.
Robert Legvold with Columbia University. Appreciate your perspectives and your insights into this, Robert. Great to have you on the show.
My pleasure.